All right, so we were looking at the Gospel of Mark this week, 14th and 15th chapters, and what I do usually on Thursday Bible study is let you guys just open it up. Do you have any discussions, some questions, some concerns, some whatever you have, thoughts that you have about the readings? Really, nothing. Anybody get a chance to outline as we talked about doing?
I don't think anybody did anything, do you?
No. Did you read? Hopefully you read at
Well,
least.
no, because I didn't know what to read.
Oh, well, the homework assignments, I'm not going to hand them out from each time because they're pretty easy. And I'll tell you what the ones when Luke will be at the end of the Bible study. But this week was just reading Mark chapter 14 and 15. And remember, we did Matthew last week. All right.
You mentioned that the woman that poured the expensive ointment on Jesus' head called nard. Nard is, at that time, extremely expensive ointment. And it was imported from the Himalayan mountains, is where that came from.
Well, you did your research on nard, on nard, but you did your research on that. That's good. So it's an ointment that it's at the very beginning of the reading, 14 verse.
2 and 3.
Yeah, verse 3.
Poured the ointment on Jesus' head, and that upset the priests because they said it was such an expensive ointment, which it was, because it was imported from the Himalayan mountains.
Do you know what it comes from? I mean, is it a sap like frankincense or myrrh, or is it something else?
I don't know, when it comes from the Himalayan mountains, you've got to think about elevations.
Mm-hmm.
It came from the mountains, but not from the upper mountains.
Sure.
Mount Everest, for instance.
Right.
No. It came from the lowlands in some sort of vegetation sack.
Okay.
That's what it was.
All right. And it would have been imported maybe along the Silk Road that was so famous at the time and everything. Would have been exported, imported into the area. Thank you for that. She anointed him with nard. Others? Y'all are quiet tonight. Did you really think we weren't going to have it, Bonnie?
Yeah, but what?
The Bible study?
No, but I haven't been, so I didn't know
Okay.
what.
I'm sorry. Well, I did have a couple of people that asked what the lesson was. So, but anyway, you know the general story, and what we're looking at, what the idea of the Bible study is to look at the Passion story from the time, essentially, of the Lord's Supper to the crucifixion, and we're going to look at it from each of the 4 different Gospels. So last week we looked at the Matthew one. We're looking today at Mark, then we'll look at Luke next week, and John in 2 weeks. And then, in addition to that, we'll concentrate on one part of that story each week. So you remember last week we looked at the Lord's Supper. Today we're going to concentrate a little bit more specifically, but I wanted you to ask your questions and have discussions of the whole thing before we did it. But we'll look more specifically in just a little bit at the Garden of Gethsemane and the arrest. So, other questions, thoughts, going all the way to the crucifixion, to the death on the cross. Anything else? All right. Well, let's get into the weeds here a little bit more with regard to the section on Gethsemane, on praying in Gethsemane. What happens with the disciples, what happens with Jesus, and then also the arrest that takes place. We're going to read that specifically, but I want to call your attention to chapter 14, verse 20, before we start. I'm sorry, it's verse 26. I got to get my glasses on. This is at the end of the Lord's Supper. We talked last week that the Lord's Supper was a celebration of, and it is a celebration of the Passover meal. At the same time that it's a celebration, Jesus, of course, knows what's getting ready to happen, even down to the details of who will betray him, what Peter's going to do, things like that. And so at a time of celebration of the Passover, which is always a celebration, Jesus had to have had all these things going on inside of him, inside of his head and inside of his heart, things going on in his soul. We actually see that in this passage today on the Gethsemane. So it's still going through the moves of celebrating the Passover meal. And I told you that what would have been there, and I think, Adonica, you shared with us last week a lot about the Seder meal and the elements that are there, from bitter herbs that are dipped into salt water, and the bitter herbs represent the bitterness of the life of the Israelites and everything. The salt water represents the tears of the Israelites, to a bone, a hip bone that's on the table, from a lamb, I believe, but I'm not sure about that. But the hip bone representing where Israel even came into existence, where Jacob wrestled with the divine being, and his hip was torn out of socket, and then he was renamed Israel. And all the other different, there's an egg that represents rebirth and new life and so forth. So it's a celebration, and they read a lot of scripture there, and they sing some songs. And you look in verse 26 there, at the end of the meal, it says, when they had sung a hymn. When they had sung a hymn. That hymn is likely the Hallel. The Hallel is just a word that we've take the word hallelujah from. The Hallel is a Hebrew word that means to celebrate. And they sing a song, and the song, the traditional Hallel at the Seder meal, at the Passover meal, would have had these words in them. Now, this is from the book, Adam Hamilton's book, 24 Hours That Changed the World. In it, he kind of divides up some of the verses from Psalm 118. The Hallel also takes verses from another psalm and puts them together. And this is traditional verses that might have been sung when the scripture tells us in verse 26, when they had sung a hymn. I want you to think about these words, because we're going to move into Gethsemane. Immediately after this, it says, and they went to the Mount of Olives. Listen to the words of this from Psalm 118. Out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me in a broad place. With the Lord on my side, I do not fear. What can mortals do to me? I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of the Lord. I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my might. He has become my salvation. What you think about those words? The last thing that they do as they leave the upper room and get ready to walk through the Kidron Valley and up onto the Mount of Olives are these words from Psalm 118. That's pretty amazing. And they have to be in the minds of at least Jesus, if not all of the disciples, as they do that. The other thing that I want to point out is the next few verses here, and I'm going to read them before we start doing our traditional reading here in a second. But I'm going to read them, and this is what happens again before they get to the Garden of Gethsemane. It actually tells us as they're walking, this is what's taking place, and it's Jesus predicting Peter's denial. This is verse 27. Jesus told them, "You will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. So just put yourself into Jesus' mind here just for a moment. Before he's going to Gethsemane, he knows what's getting ready to happen. But before he goes to Gethsemane, not only have they sung that hymn about God will deliver and I cry out to you in my distress and those types of words, but now he's saying in a very real way, and we'll just call him this, his best friend is going to deny that he even knows him. So this is the whatever you want to call it, the emotional environment that they're in before they go to Gethsemane. David, I'm going to have you start on verse 32. Just read two or three, with a smaller group. So read 2 or 3 verses here, starting on verse 32, and then you could pass it on to another person. I'm not going to stop you. Sometimes I stop you guys, but we'll go back and look at the verses verse by verse in just a moment. So verse 32, David, if you want to read 2 or 3 verses.
They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to the disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Let me continue.
If you want to give it to Adonica, that's fine.
After walking a little farther from them, Jesus fell to the ground and prayed that, if possible, he would not have this time of suffering. He prayed, "Abba, Father, you can do all things. Take away this cup of suffering, but do what you want, not what I want."
He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Before you a cup from me, yet not what I want."
Keep going, Chuck. 37.
But he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter and Simon, "Are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? But keep awake and pray, for you may not come into the time of the trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak."
Gene, 39.
No glasses.
Oh, okay.
39.
Jack, 39.
Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say.
And he came the third time and said to them, "Sleep on now, and take your rest. It's enough, the hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise up, let us go. Lo, he that betrays me is at hand."
Let's stop there for a second. Just talk about it. Why? Why do you think Jesus goes to Gethsemane to pray? And I'm talking about location here for a second. Why Gethsemane?
Was it near though?
It was near. It's across the Kidron Valley and then up a little bit up a mountain.
But that's not why. Okay.
No, it's near. That's one reason why. Absolutely.
I think he
There's
wanted-
no right answer. We don't know for
I think he
sure.
wanted to be alone, and he had been a crowd with controlling his every for a couple of days, and get enough of that. And he was wanting to be alone. He was wanting to get away, and he wanted to get one-on-one with God.
Okay.
And to do that, he had to get by himself for a little while.
I think that's probably true. It's outside the city walls, but it's still quite close. And so, yeah, I think being alone was
As far
absolutely
as there
fine.
being anything significant about Gethsemane or what the name means or anything like that, now I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Maybe you do.
Well, the name means olive press, and olive press. And so most historians, I think if you go visit it today, they even have it set up this way. But most historians think that just because there's the Mount of Olives, because there were a lot of olive trees, there still are a lot of olive trees on the Mount of Olives, that it was a place that the women especially would go and press olives and make olive oil. They would end up making the waxy stuff to make into soaps and things like that. But the name just means olive press. What kind of significance that there is, Google it and have some fun, but I think that's mostly speculation. I think you're definitely onto something, though. This is a place that he can get outside of the city and be alone during what has already been a pretty difficult week, especially in the temple. What else? Any other reasons in Gethsemane, do you think? In the Gospel of Luke, it says, and I think it's the only gospel it says this. It says, and then they set off to the Garden of Gethsemane, where they went often to pray. Now, and so I'm not sure exactly why they went there often. I don't know whether this was a place that people from out of town, I mean, remember, he's a Galilean, he's not from Jerusalem, he's not a Judean, and so maybe people from out of town would go set up for the night and camp out at night during very busy times. Remember, this is the week of Passover, so Jerusalem would have been very, very busy, and so maybe that was just a place that they camped. I don't know, I'm not sure. I know that he went to the city of Bethany from time to time when he came into Jerusalem, because he's had some friends there. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived in Bethany, and that wasn't far away. Anybody else want to speculate? What, Gethsemane? How about the idea of a garden? Anybody just go to gardens?
Well, it's probably a comfortable place for him.
Yeah.
He knew it, and he was comfortable there, and he could pray with comfort.
Yeah. I know lots of people that just they connected by nature, and that's a special place to be and everything. There's one thing that thing that I've read about. I've seen this in person when I've stood on the Mount of Olives. It also faces the eastern wall. We always talk about the western wall being there, but it would have faced the eastern wall of Jerusalem. And there was a gate called the Beautiful Gate, and it's prophesied that the Messiah is going to return at that gate too. And so maybe it's overlooking that and has a religious or a spiritual significance as well, to be able to observe the city of Jerusalem. All right, how about this question? And this is more of a personal question. I'm trying to get into the head of Jesus here. What do you think is the hardest part of this experience for Jesus?
Knowing it all ahead of time.
Knowing everything ahead of time. And so being obedient to what's going to take place. That'd be hard. Have you ever experienced that before?
Yes, as a matter of fact.
You mind sharing? Yeah. You mind sharing?
Well, this isn't probably in the same thing, but I always knew that my daughter was going to die. And this is my daughter, Deborah. And when she started driving, I would sit up, because on Congress Avenue, all you would hear were sirens all night long, and you know. So I sat up every night and waited until she came home, whatever it was. So we were here in Helen on vacation, and we had Jennifer with us, and it was her first birthday. And I got a phone call, and sure enough, it was, I don't know, I think it was my mother. It's hysterical. Anyway, it never occurred to me that this wouldn't happen this way. I knew that I wouldn't be there. You know, it was just all in my mind. It was there from the get-go. And it was in an accident, and she was killed, and the girl who was with her was badly injured, and the girl no. Well, there was 2 cars involved, and 2 people were dead.
Mm.
I think it was Jennifer and the friend that she had with her. And it just, there it was, all laid out.
Why do you think you always felt that you knew that?
Because I did.
Was it more about your daughter? Deborah was her name?
Yeah.
Was it more about who she was and that you just thought something was going to happen to her, or did you feel that you I don't know,
No, it's
something
spec-
spiritual
No,
or
it
something.
was specifically her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there you go. Happened when I wasn't here and all that stuff.
But you listened and waited up for her and heard sirens and
Well, that
you
was
knew what was
prior
going
to going
Yeah, I
on
know.
vacation.
Right, right.
But I used to just sit and wait.
This could be painful. Yeah. Anybody else know things that you feel like? I appreciate you, Bonnie. Feel like you knew something bad was getting ready to happen.
I knew ahead of time my brother was gonna be killed. It was in a car wreck also. I just knew there was something going to happen because for several nights I had dreams where I would see someone in a coffin, but I couldn't see who it was. So it was like I knew, so when they knocked on the door at 2 in the morning, he'd been coming home from church, he was a youth director at church, and he was on his way home. And, it was like, yeah, okay. Everybody, you should be falling apart. It was like I was prepared. And he had even, the day, he got killed that night, but that day, he was going to be preaching at the church on the next Sunday. And he said, even if something happens to me, please come on and hear it anyway. It was almost like he knew ahead of time.
Wow, those are spiritual ones that y'all have shared. Sometimes we just know, though, if somebody is really sick, of course. We have an idea, and something's going to happen. So, how about to continue with the question, how about what else might have been the hardest part of this experience for Jesus? We mentioned knowing ahead of time. That was Bonnie's answer. We've shared a couple of those. What else would be the hardest part? Might be the hardest part.
Knowing your friends are going to turn on you
Yeah.
and deny you.
Yeah. Have anybody experienced that? Boy, we're being uplifting today, aren't we? So, anybody had friends that turned on them? And where I'm trying to go is to just get into what's actually taking place. Sometimes we read the Word. Sometimes we read the Bible, sadly, and we don't really get ourselves in there. And that's kind of what we're doing here. I'm not trying to open up wounds here and everything, but just imagine for a moment that your best friends, your best friends are going to betray you. I mean, there has to be a reason, as we were reading Gethsemane, there has to be a reason that all of the disciples, maybe not Judas, of course, with them, but 11 of the disciples and Jesus walk across the Kidron Valley. Look at your maps that you have there. These are maps of Jerusalem. On the lower left side of the map in what is called lower Jerusalem, I believe, or the old city, the lower city, upper city, I'm sorry, it's the upper city, is the upper room. You'll see on the bottom there, left of the upper room. And you see the Kidron Valley over to the right, and you see the Mount of Olives and Gethsemane. So how does Jesus get? He's crossing, he either crosses all the way through the city, or he walks down from the upper city. There are some stairs. There's some, I don't know what they're made of. I guess they would be made of marble or something, but there's some stairs that still exist today that go from that upper city down into the Hinnom Valley. And they believe that those were stairs that went up to the house of Caiaphas, that Jesus might have been paraded when he was arrested from Gethsemane and brought up there. So maybe he descended those and went through the Hinnom Valley, up through the Kidron Valley, and to the Mount of Olives. We don't know. We don't know whether he went through the city of Jerusalem in the middle of the night, but he did with 11 disciples. He gets to the Mount of Olives, crosses over the Kidron Valley, gets to the Mount of Olives, and then he stops his disciples and he says to 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, y'all come further with me. Y'all come further with me. And he wants, don't y'all get the sense that he wants the 3 of them, who've got to be his closest buddies here, they've got to be the closest ones to him, to be with him during this really difficult time, this time of trial. And so, these are the closest people in his life. It's got to be hard to know. One's going to sell me out. Another one's going to deny that they even know me. And all of them are going to desert me at the cross. Except maybe John, if you're reading the Gospel of John. Think about that. Were you going to say something, Marcia?
Who, me?
I thought Marcia was going to get ready to say something.
I could say something.
What?
Well, I think that he chose to go there simply because he knew what was going to happen, and he did not want to draw it out any longer than he had to. And so if he went to Gethsemane, which was closest to the gate, I think he said, or something.
Well, yeah, that was more of a symbolic gate, but yeah.
Okay, well, it would be easier to go quicker than all these other ways over here.
But interestingly enough, if you look at the map, what most people think happened is that he was, of course, arrested by the religious authorities, with some help of Roman soldiers, perhaps. But I believe these were soldiers of the temple. And most scholars believe that he was brought all the way back to the house of Caiaphas, which is near the upper room there. So he's brought all the way back there. He was definitely not taken directly to Pontius Pilate, because remember, there's going to be a trial of the Sanhedrin, and they don't believe that the trial took place in the temple or around the temple. They believe that it might have taken place there in the house of Caiaphas. If you go there today, of course, everything's all built up in Jerusalem, so you can't see it the way Jesus would have seen it. But there is a kind of a big well that exists that some people claim might have been the place where Jesus spent the last night of his life, right there up underneath the house of Caiaphas. So yeah. Okay.
I went through this once I feel really bad for Judas. I think he gets the wrong end of the stick. I read that Judas actually was Jesus' best friend. He grew up with him. And they played together all the time and everything and blah, blah, blah.
Really?
However, this was, something that was preordained. It was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And poor Judas, all these many, many years has taken,
A lot of blame.
yeah.
Even his name is something quite negative. So it's interesting. I don't know that we know for sure. There is something that's been, quote, discovered called the Gospel of Judas. You probably heard about it in the news. If you hadn't read it, it's actually an interesting read. And it takes your point. There's specific lines in there where Jesus actually thanks him for fulfilling the will of God and everything. It's a very interesting document, if not real. That's for people to make up their own mind about. But it's also apparently a very old document too. I think they've done some
Extremely
testing.
interesting.
Yeah.
You all need to just get on Google and get that.
So. But as of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what they say is this was not a good thing that Judas did by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. Famous line, I think, Chuck, you were the one that read it, that said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We've heard that all our lives. Does that connect with y'all? You ever have times when the spirit is willing to be a part of something or do something, but tell us about it. You're nodding your head over there, Gene. Do you just...
How many times did you do it?
The body,
Well,
the body sometimes can't keep up, can it? So, and this is in the middle of the night. I think last week we mentioned that maybe one of the reasons these disciples are falling asleep is because they've eaten so much. That happens to me too.
well, and they drank.
And they drank wine. Very good, Bonnie. Is it 3 cups of wine at the Seder meal, or is it 5?
It ends up with about 5.
Yeah, that's a lot
The
of.
final wine is the one that he's gonna drink with him
That's right.
in the end, so that's the 5th cup.
Okay. And does each person have their own cup, or is it shared cup, or?
It depends on.
Yeah, that's
where
fascinating.
you're.
But either way, it's a lot of wine. So they've been drinking, they've been eating. I might take a nap myself. But well, tell us about the nap. Oh, Jesus is pretty upset with them here, isn't he? Would you be upset? How would you feel if you specifically said, "Be with me"? You're three of my very, very good friends. Be with me. I need you right now. We've already
But he didn't
we've already
say-
talked about all the things that are on Jesus' mind,
He
but
didn't say to stay awake.
he didn't say stay awake. But he seemed upset that they fell asleep. He seemed upset they fell asleep. So.
Well, yes, but he did not tell them, look, I want you to go with me and I want you to stay awake.
But he said, stay here and watch.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's pretty.
Stay here and watch.
Yeah, that means don't go to sleep.
He wants them to be with him. He needs some. You know, one of the things I guess we can wrestle with this. We'll talk about this when we do the crucifixion too, but we can wrestle with this idea of, and I think we should wrestle with this idea of the humanity of Jesus. I think we Protestants like to gloss over this a lot. We often don't hear sermons on the cross much anymore. You know, we'll hopefully, depending on what happens with this virus, we'll have a Holy Week where we have an opportunity to have a Last Supper together on Thursday night, and on Friday we have Good Friday, and we talk about the cross and experience those types of things. But we Protestants aren't particularly good about that. I think Catholics get the humanity of Jesus, and I think we need to remember that he is a human being. And he definitely sounds like a human being in Gethsemane. I will do what you want, Father. If this is your will, I will do it. But if you can take this cup away from me. That sounds very human to me. Very human. Well, let's keep reading. I think we stopped with Marcia. So, Bonnie, if you'll start us back up, and David, when she gets done, it's going to come back around to you, so you can be ready. But, Bonnie, if you'll start us on verse 43, this is going to be the arrest.
And immediately, even as Jesus said this, Judas, one of the 12 disciples, arrived with a crowd of men armed with swords and clubs. They had been sent by the leading priests, the teachers of the religious law, and the elders. The traitor Judas had given them a prearranged signal. You will know which one to arrest when I greet him with a kiss. Then you can take him away under guard. As soon as they arrived, Judas walked up to Jesus. Rabbi, he exclaimed, and gave him the kiss.
46. David.
46?
Yeah.
Okay. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you didn't arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled.
And you get the strange verse here. Go ahead with it, Adonica.
A young man wearing only a linen cloth was following Jesus, and the people also grabbed him. But the cloth he was wearing came off, and he ran away naked.
There you go. And that's where we're going to end today. I'm not ending the discussion, but that's where we're going to end the reading. So, very odd little point that Mark adds there. I remember studying that 5 or 6 years ago before a Bible study, and I don't remember what it's about, to be frank with you. But anybody else know anything about that man that runs off naked? Go ahead. And I love these annotations that we have in Bibles. Bonnie, go ahead.
This says, tradition says that this young man may have been John Mark, the writer of this gospel. The incident is not mentioned in any other accounts.
Okay.
So it would make sense, that's what mine says too.
Okay.
Same thing.
Yeah, no, you have similar life application Bibles, are those? Or,
No, mine just has that down at the bottom.
Yeah.
As an explanation of that verse.
Oh, that's what,
Yeah.
good. Well, thank you for sharing that. Like I said, it's been years since I actually looked that up. And one of the things I think that would lead me to is something that I did read in Adam Hamilton's book, where he said that he was thankful when Jesus spoke to the people about what was going to happen. He was thankful that Jesus said to Judas last week during the Lord's Supper, when we were reading that, Jesus said to Judas, "You're going to be the one that will betray me." He was. This is Adam Hamilton talking. He was thankful that he talks to Peter about the fact that Peter's going to deny him 3 times and everything. In John, what y'all are saying about John Mark is he's putting himself in that story. He's there. He runs away naked. He's a part of this desertion that takes place. They all deserted Jesus, is what the scripture says there. And so he places himself in that story. And the reason that Adam Hamilton says that he's thankful that Jesus, that these bad things happen, is because at the end of the day, they're all forgiven. They're all, not Judas, of course, but all these people that deserted Jesus are forgiven, that Jesus doesn't treat them as enemies or horrible people. They're still his friends in many ways. And so how might that speak to us in all the ways that we might today betray our faith and betray our relationship with Jesus? And so I think that those were pretty interesting words to read Adam Hamilton write about that, and I don't know if he's spoken further about that. So, but any thoughts about the arrest? Nothing special going on there. Didn't get much about a little bit more detail, and this is where those outlines might come into play if y'all want to just kind of look at, or just at least pay attention as you read Luke and John. We've already read Matthew. That they might provide some additional details. The cutting off of the ear, the raising of a sword, the name of the person whose ear is cut off, the healing of Jesus. So particularly in this story of Gethsemane, I told y'all last week when we started this Bible study that of all the things that we find in the 4 Gospels, the birth of Jesus, the sermons that he does, the healing of people that he does, the thing that is miraculously the same, not miraculous is the wrong word, but the thing that is remarkably the same in all 4 Gospels is this passion story. It's not very different. And we're going to concentrate on the trials of Jesus. Next week, it just was serendipity that this happened, but we'll also be looking at it in the Gospel of Luke. And Luke adds Herod to the equation, where the other Gospels don't add it. But that's only 5 or 6 verses. Other than that, you can read 2 whole chapters of the Bible in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the narrative is pretty close. And we've talked about how different John is. I've joked with you that it's the weirdo gospel, because it's so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke in every other area. But all of a sudden, when it gets to after the Lord's Supper and his arrest, when it gets to Jesus' arrest, his trials, the crucifixion, the details are remarkably similar. But pay attention to some of those differences, because there will be a few here and there, and that might kind of speak to you as you read. You say, oh, that didn't happen in Mark last week. Any other thoughts? All right, I appreciate you guys. Hope you have a good week and a good night tonight. Stay safe, stay healthy, and all things staying the same or not any dramatic changes. We'll do this again next week, okay?
now we're in Luke next week.
Oh, thank you, Luke. Thank you for that. I want to make sure I get it right. It's going to be Luke chapters. It's the same story again. Luke chapters 22 and 23. Luke 22 and 23. And what we might, I don't know whether y'all would have fun doing this post-Easter stuff, but if we wanted to do this all over again with the Easter stories, we could do that and read them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Come back and do that. Anyway, have a good night. Appreciate you guys, and blessings to you all.